All right, so the last thing we want to take a look at this chapter is specific programs of the New Deal. So yesterday we took a look at the fact that the New Deal, in my way of explaining it, is like a shotgun blast to the Great Depression. Those New Deal programs were designed to solve multiple problems. And so when you take a look at what FDR and the Brain Trust were doing with their programs, is they were coming up with individual programs that solved 3 or 4 different problems in creative ways. And so we talked about yesterday was starting to take a look at specifically how the New Deal accomplished this. We talked about the first problem they had to address was banking. Money is the lifeblood of the American economy. Banks are like the heart that pump that money into the economy. If Americans aren't putting their money in banks, and if banks aren't giving out loans, then businesses don't get created, jobs don't get created, people don't build stuff, they don't buy stuff, and the economy grinds to a halt. So when the Great Depression started, when the stock market crashed and Americans had their run on banks and banks started to fold across the country, the problem was as the banks went under, people didn't spend money. As people don't spend money, we tumble into the Depression. So yesterday we looked at things like that they did to try to get Americans going back to banks. The Glass-Steagall Act made sure that banks couldn't just lend your money to people doing irresponsible things like investing. The FDIC ensures your life savings in banks so that even if the bank goes under, you're not going to lose your life savings. And we talked about how that piece of legislation is the very reason why back in 2008, as well as right now, you're not seeing Americans panic and pull all their money out of the banks, and why at this moment we're still keeping ourselves from tumbling into a depression. The last thing we talked about yesterday was pump priming. This process where if banks are struggling to that degree, then it's the government's responsibility to inject money back into the economy to get the American people going. And so what we call this pump priming is much like when you get a well started by pouring water from the outside to get the well going and drawing on its own. The government will pour money into the economy to get the economy rolling on its own. Now, Democrats and Republicans both agree this is the best way to get the economy going. This is why even as divided as our Congress and our president are today, they still were able to pass the stimulus program to get money injected back into the economy to help the American people during this period of time. The question becomes, how exactly do you do it, and for how long do you prime that pump? So for example, Donald Trump, he put that pump priming into stimulus checks, $1,200 checks they sent to every family, to encourage the American people to continue spending money. The responsible thing to do at this point in time is probably, if you're laid off from your job, to slow down how much you spend to try to be able to pay your bills and take care of your family. While that's responsible for you and your individual families, it doesn't help the economy. So the objective behind President Trump's stimulus check, and you would have seen George Bush did the same thing back in 2008, is they send money to people's homes, encourage them to continue spending, which encourages them to continue getting through this period of time and keep the economy going. Another way of going about this pump priming is not necessarily giving money directly to the people, but giving it to programs that are going to create goods and services for the people and jobs. So for example, FDR's pump priming was he created the PWA, the Public Works Administration, where they looked around the country and they found various different needs that had to be addressed, and the government created jobs for people to meet those needs using government money. So for example, yesterday we talked about the Shenango Dam and the Rec Center in Greenville are 2 very local examples of public works programs that were created to create jobs, to create the materials that had to be put together in factories to make those goods, all that funded by the government in creating jobs and keeping the American people going. Last thing we want to look at here today is a couple more specific examples of programs during the Great Depression that the New Deal were typified by. These are the typical types of plans the Brain Trust came up with. So once again, there were many programs that we can't even go through all of them here, and I don't want to. But objective here is that we want to look at a couple, 2 or 3 different programs that specifically give you the idea of the types of things that the New Deal was trying to accomplish. One program that solves multiple problems. So, for example, the Tennessee Valley Authority was a government-funded program that bought land from poor farmers and then took their farms, flooded them out, created dams, and then those dams were used to create hydroelectric plants for cheap government-funded subsidized electricity for those people. So let's take a look at this. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. We're referring to the Tennessee River Valley that runs from the northern part of Mississippi through parts of Alabama and into the eastern part of Tennessee. Now that Tennessee River Valley, the farmers that were living in that region during the Great Depression were incredibly poor. The river flooded quite often. The farmland was not very easily accessible, and those farmers were struggling in that region. It was widely understood that if the government could create a series of locks, channels, and dams, that they could dam up the Tennessee River, improve the flooding issues, use irrigation to improve the farmlands, and that they could use that land to they could use those dams to then create hydroelectric plants that would provide cheap electricity to the people living there. So what the government did was they took these poor farmers that lived in towns like this one in the bottom left here, all across the Tennessee River Valley, in places like Muscle Shoals, Alabama, places like northern parts of Mississippi and the eastern part of Tennessee. They bought up all of these farms. They then took those farms and they didn't even bother using them for farmland. They just simply flooded them in. The farmers that they had purchased that land off of, they gave jobs building those dams. And then once those dams were built, the farmland that was left over was much more easily able to grow because they were now able to use the dams to irrigate those crops and to effectively grow them. And then the farmers who were left over who had sold their farms now worked at the hydroelectric plants, gave them jobs, to which those hydroelectric plants created cheap electricity to everybody living in the region. So you take a look at the problems. They solved 3 or 4 problems with one program. Farmers were going to lose everything in the Tennessee River Valley. They were going to lose their farms. Their families were going to starve. They were going to lose everything. The government purchases that farm and gets them out of debt. The government then uses that land to build a series of dams, which create jobs for people building the actual dams. Once the dam is constructed, irrigation helps the farmers who are left in the region more effectively grow farms so that they can save themselves and their families. The farmers who had to sell their land, well, now they get jobs working in the hydroelectric plants. And then the hydroelectric plant creates cheap electricity for everybody in the region, improving their quality of life. One program solves 5 different problems. Another creative example of the New Deal programs that the Brain Trust was creating, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. One of the things that they recognized during the Great Depression is that young men were competing with older men for jobs. And this was creating a problem for older men who had families to support. If you've got a factory job, you're going to hire a young guy who's in his late teens, early 20s, who's healthy, strong, fit, and can do considerably more work than you're going to hire somebody in his 40s who has maybe a family to support, but he's not as physically capable. So what did the CCC do? They found jobs for those 18 to 25-year-old young men who were single, living at home with their family, and they shipped them off to different parts of the country, achieving various different goals. So, for example, if you were an 18-year-old young man who was living at home, you were single, you weren't married, you had nothing else, but you were another mouth to feed at your family house, what they do with the CCC is they get you a job. Maybe you live here in Western Pennsylvania, they'll ship you off to Kansas planting trees to help build forests and help out with the Dust Bowl situation. They might ship you off to parts of Minnesota fighting forest fires out there in the forests up there, or any number of different programs. But what happens is the government gets you out of your area so that you don't compete with older men like me who might need work to support their families. Now, if you're an 18-year-old man, why would you do this? Well, one, A, it's kind of an adventure. Gives you an opportunity to go across the country and see different parts of the United States that you might not otherwise see. Also, if you're 18 to 25, you're unattached and you're single, you don't need so much money because the government's going to provide you with food, clothing, housing, and entertainment where you're going. So the money that the government pays you, you don't need. What do they do with that money? They send it back home to support your parents. You get paid $30 a month if you join the CCC. 22 of those $30 is being sent back home to your mom and dad to help support the family. So now you don't have to feel guilty about leaving the family there. So what does the CCC do? It accomplishes getting jobs, doing things that the people in those areas need. They needed trees built in the Dust Bowl to try to help with those farms. They needed to have people that were funded by the government to fight forest fires and build dams and dig ditches in various different places and create parks. They needed to get all that stuff accomplished. 2, you get the young men out of their area so they don't take jobs away from older men who need to support families. And 3, you find a way to still support your family because most of your checks being sent back home. Another creative thing by another creative program of the New Deal, the NYA, the National Youth Administration. The government actually paid students to stay in school. Once again, what's the purpose of this? Teenagers, they don't want them taking jobs away from men who are supporting families. Remember, last chapter we even talked about the fact that the American culture at the time, many Americans felt like felt like they were letting their families down because they were losing everything during the Depression. Well, now you've got a solution to this problem. Those men can get to work. They don't have to compete with young people for jobs. We keep those young people in school. Now, they weren't just outright sending you a check to go to school, but what they were doing with the NYA was finding you after school work. So after school was over, you might help out in the library sorting through books. You might help janitors do various different tasks around the building and different things like that. And in order to get a job through the NYA, you had to prove that you were still enrolled in school.